Welcome to today's program in the Our Finger Lakes History series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. With the mid-December anniversary of the World War II Battle of the Bulge rapidly approaching, I have chosen for today's program to talk about the last stages of World War II in Europe. But rather than simply recounting the factual history, I want us to experience the war through the writings of Fran Heard and Lynn. Shown here, you see on the left a picture of Lynn, and on the right a war picture of Fran Heard. But before talking about these two men specifically, I thought we should look at some of the general factual realities of World War II. More than 60 million people perished in World War II. While the United States suffered 400,000 fatalities in World War II, that was the smallest percentage of its population for any of the major powers fighting the war. The United States clearly became the arsenal of democracy, producing the bulk of the aircraft, ships, and tanks used in successfully waging the war. NBC newsman Tom Brokaw wrote the book The Greatest Generation, relating the stories of several young men who successfully won the war. At a time when these young men should have been enjoying their early adult lives, they were instead fighting a war in the most primitive and horrible conditions you can imagine. The stories of Lynn and Fran Heard that I'm going to share in this program are not in Brokaw's book, but they easily could have been. Some of the writing that Fran Heard sent home was Vmails. Soldiers during World War II could send their letters home by airmail or by this Vmail. Perhaps you are not familiar with what Vmail was, so let me explain how it worked. The soldier would write his letter, and it would be read by a censor and approved, and then copied to film. The film would then be sent to the post office nearest to the mailing address that the letter was being sent to. At that destination post office, the letter would then be printed into hard copy and placed in a specially designed envelope and then delivered. Here you see an example. Now, mail of the soldiers was subject to censorship. Soldiers were not to provide any specific information as to their location, military strategy, and so on. If a letter did contain such information, the censor reading the letter would simply cut out the censored wording. You will note that a letter would then be stamped on the envelope, as shown in the right picture, that it has been passed by the censor. The first person I'm going to talk about in this program is Fran Heard. I got to know Fran Heard personally when I became Seneca County historian in August of 2003, since he was also working part-time at the county office building at the time. Fran and I would talk briefly almost every day that the both of us were working. His main work area was right next to my office. Early on, I learned from Fran that his mother had kept every letter that he wrote back home when he was in the service in World War II. Here you see a picture of Fran at the left as he looked at age approximately 90, as well as one of his service photos and some newspaper clippings. Fran was working at the Seneca Ordnance Depot when he was drafted at age 19. In October 1943, after his basic training here in the States, he went overseas to the British Isles, obviously to be a part of the new Western Front that would be launched against Germany in summer 1944. Fran was a trained truck driver in the motor pool for the 291st Combat Engineers. The 291st Combat Engineers became famously known as those damned engineers who built bridges and so on, making it possible for Allied forces to advance on Nazi Germany. It wasn't until 2003, however, that Fran learned that his mother had kept all the letters that he had written home. He found those letters when he was cleaning out his mother's house after she died in 2003 at the age of 99. Each letter was numbered on the envelope in the order in which it was received. I have taken Fran's wording from several of his letters and organized it into the narrative that I'm sharing with you. In each slide, you will find his actual writing in bold black. Here you see that on October 22nd, 1943, his letter says that he has safely arrived in England. Note that his address for the letter is somewhere in England. Had he given the exact town location, it would have been clearly censored. His reference to so much water is clearly referring to the Atlantic Ocean. Must have been quite a thing for a 19-20-year-old young man to be crossing on his ship this huge Atlantic Ocean. His comments on driving on the left side of the road I find interesting. The November 20th letter refers to horses and carriages being used for a funeral in England. That might sound strange to us today, but we have to remember it was 1943. His December 26th letter makes it clear that Christmas was just another day of work, but they did have a turkey dinner supper. The April 9th, 1944 letter was written after he had been in England for over 5 months. Imagine these months of amassing these soldiers, getting the equipment ready for launching this Western Front. The June 6, 1944 letter is written the night of the famous D-Day invasion of Normandy, France. Fran was not actually part of the invasion. He won't cross the English Channel until some 3 weeks later, but he was sure glad to hear of the successful landing on the Normandy beaches that morning for D-Day. His July 3, 1944 letter told of his crossing the English Channel. Note in these writings how he says that all those in the 291st Engineers are working night and day. That last statement, so until then, good luck and don't worry, but just imagine trying to get your mother not to be worried about you as a soldier in the war. The July 23, 1944 letter tells of his having to deal with all the mud. It's hard to, in a sense, imagine how huge trucks like what he was driving could get mired in the mud, so it must have been a real problem. The August 1st letter tells of digging the foxholes. In his August 29th letter, he tells of his working for over 2 days without sleep, but that he did get a chance to swim in the Seine River while he was waiting for the truck to be ready. In his October 5th, 1944 letter, Fran is wishing his family a nice Christmas, giving enough time to make sure the letter was going to get home. He's wishing them a good Christmas, even though he doesn't know just where he will be or what he will be doing that day of Christmas Day. It's in his October 13th, 1944 letter that Fran is finally writing a letter telling all about what he was doing in England and France, so that he wouldn't have to worry anymore about any censorship of the details of the letter. Now, his writing is not perfect grammar or spelling, but it does give us a real feeling about what he was experiencing as a soldier. And you have to remember, he's only 20 years old that he's writing this. In his December 4th, 1944 letter, Fran expresses his fears that the war and military service has so changed him that he doubts he could go back to civilian life and settle down and live right again. In his January 4th, 1945 letter, he writes about what he did Christmas Day. He spent it in a foxhole, and he spent New Year's Day hauling cinders in his truck. In his February 11th letter, he gets more specific about spending Christmas Day in the foxhole, ducking 88 shells and bombs that he was hearing, some even exploding what sounded like right over his head. In that same letter, he makes reference to the Germans breaking through at Melbody, and that's something I'll be discussing in greater detail shortly. In that same letter, he starts a sentence indicating that the soldiers were not to talk to any German civilian. But he doesn't finish the sentence because it would have clearly been censored if he had gotten into what would really happen to them as a penalty. Fran Heard and his fellow 291st Engineers landed on Omaha Beach about 3 weeks after D-Day. On the beach, they were busy filling in bomb holes, picking up human bodies, and so on. Imagine the possibility that some of those bodies might have been there for 3 weeks. They were busy building roads and bridges to get supplies to the main battle line. In this map, the red arrow points to the village of Carrington. The 291st Engineers had to rebuild the Tucker Bridge with a bypass to get supplies into Carrington. From the Normandy beach in France, the Allied forces continued to push the German forces back towards Germany. Fran Heard and the others in the 291st Engineers progressed from Normandy Beach into Belgium. Note the small red dotted line that marked the line of the German forces on December 15th, 1944. That location on that date is going to be important for what I'm going to be talking about in terms of the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, the German forces launched an offensive that has become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Fran wrote in his letter, "We knew something was going to happen, but we didn't know all of the specifics." The yellow arrow points to the location of Melbody. He also wrote, the 291st had orders to move into Melbody and hold and protect the city at all costs. There were only about 100 of us. So here, imagine, only about 100 members of the 291st Engineers, a motor pool unit, being given the orders to militarily defend the city of Melbody against advancing German panzer tanks. The 291st Engineers were motor pool people. They weren't frontline fighters, and they were given that order to defend Melbody at all costs. On December 17th, 84 American soldiers who had surrendered were murdered in what became known as the Melbody Massacre. Fran in a letter wrote, "We heard the shots from the massacre when the Germans shot the people of Melbody. We were 3 miles from the site. We found out exactly what happened the next day." Tragedy. In his December 21st letter, Fran made it clear how little ammunition and weapons the 291st Engineers had to defend Malmedy against these advancing German tanks. He said if the Germans had known how little ammo we had, they could have come right through. What they had were M1 rifles, 6 .30 caliber machine guns, 12 bazookas, and some mines that they could place in the roads. But the 291st men held on in their defense of Malmedy. Finally, U.S. Army Air Force planes came in to help with the defense, but even there was a problem. There was so much smoke in the air that the Army Air Force men couldn't see the pink signals that the U.S. soldiers of the 291st were sending up, and they were actually bombing. Fran, in a letter, described how the 291st men set up roadblocks and laid daisy mines across the roads. Specifically, he wrote, "One of our mine bombs blew the track off a German tank, so the German tanks turned around. German troop commander Piper slapped his thigh and said, 'Those damned engineers.' That's how we got the nickname, Those Damned Engineers." I was with Fran when he was interviewed in November 2010 by a historian for the World War II Museum located in New Orleans, and then again when he was interviewed in October 2012 for a program on the Battle of the Bulge for the History Channels. In that latter interview, Fran modestly said, "We all just did our job. That's what we had been trained to do, and that's what we done. You knew what had to be done." Here is the headline for the Geneva Daily Times on December 27, 1944. Notice how it says, Battle of Bulge mounts towards climax. I trust you can begin to understand how Fran's mother and father and sister must have fretted over seeing such headlines and wondering if their loved one was going to be a casualty. There certainly wasn't going to be a cell phone call as soon as possible to get the word home. They were going to have to wait for a letter from Fran or that dreadfully dreaded knock at the door. Now, this is a map that appeared in that same December 27th newspaper, and you can see it shows the advances of the German armies in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge and had to be pushed back. That same newspaper contained an article of a Lodi soldier that was being reported as wounded in action. The 291st Engineers did their job. They defended, perhaps with a lot of luck, the city of Malmedy against the advancing German soldiers, Piper's tanks. The unit was given a special citation for their efforts in defending the city of Malmedy against the German attacks. And here is, on the left, the full citation, and on the right, a close-up of a portion of it in which it really spells out exactly what they did. It was on January 25th, 2014 that Fran's family held a big 90th birthday celebration for Fran. In the top left photo, you can see Fran is breaking down as he relives some of his war memories with two of his longtime friends. The bottom right picture shows Fran with his daughter and son-in-law on his right, our left, his partner, and then his son Charles on the extreme right. Now, I successfully nominated Fran to be honored as the 2014 Seneca County Senior Citizen of the Year. Unfortunately, he passed away suddenly just shortly before the actual recognition luncheon took place, but he knew he had been given the award. In my brief remarks at that luncheon, I referred to specifics of how he played a part in the 291st engineers' defense of Malbady against advancing German tanks. I concluded my remarks with the comment, honoring him with this award helps to give proper recognition to all those young men and women who sacrificed so much for the defense of the United States in World War II. And it helps to instill in everyone the reality that they can contribute in their own way, regardless of age, to the betterment of the community. Now I'm going to shift gears to talk about our second soldier late in the European theater, and that is Sergeant Leslie Lynn. Les also had two brothers that served in the armed forces during World War II, and that was not unusual. Les Lynn was a bull turret gunner on a B-17 bomber. Now, the bull turret is located on the underside of the plane. Les kept daily journal writings, and he turned them into a book called War in the Blue, a remembrance, and you can still buy a copy of the book online. Les's first bombing mission came on February 26, 1945, late in the European War. He and his crew, the other members of his crew, flew from their base in England to bomb a railroad marshalling area in the northwest sector of Berlin. They dropped their bombs at an elevation of 31,000 feet. The outside temperature was 35 degrees below zero, and it must have been pretty cold for Les in that mostly glass-enclosed bull turret on the underside of the aircraft. But at least Les had a pretty good view of the bombs being dropped from that bull turret, and it's not surprising, he wrote, I could see those big bombs dropping away, and as they disappeared into the clouds, I had a feeling of elation, knowing those eggs we had just laid were our first installment of repayment to Hitler and the Nazis for all the cruelty and torture they had wrought upon the peace-loving people of the world. In the picture at left, you get an idea of the view of seeing bombs dropping from aircraft bombing German targets. In the bottom right picture, you see what a B-17 aircraft looked like. In the top picture at right, you can see an arrow pointing to the location of the bull turret on the underside of the aircraft. Here is a picture of the crew that Les was part of. Les is in the standing row, the second person from the left. What we would probably say a very handsome-looking young man. When the Germans knew that enemy aircraft was approaching, they would typically send up what has been called a flak storm, so as to make it more difficult for the enemy aircraft to see their bombing targets. And in these pictures you can see all of the flak. Now it is Les's 18th bombing mission on April 10th that I want to focus on. As in the previous bombing missions, they had left their base in England and had a bombing target somewheres near Berlin. In the case of April 10th, it was an ordnance factory in suburban Oranienburg. On the way to the target, he noted the destructiveness of all of the previous bombing raids that had been made. Now, they dropped their bombs on the target without encountering any resistance, but all of a sudden that changed as they were attacked by two German jets. He said, I was able to see the one that came in from 7 o'clock pull up out of its dive, and I gave it a good burst from my twin 50s. I will never, never forget that sight. There was that beautiful big silver jet with its black swastikas on the underside of its wings, and my tracer bullets going right into its belly. The plane next to Les's was shot down by other German jets. As the German jets kept making passes to attack, Lynn wrote later, the German pilots kept making passes at us from the rear, coming down from high positions and preventing me on the underside of the plane from getting any shots off, and I never felt so helpless. I could hear my crewmates firing at those jet fighters, but I couldn't see them because they were above the ship. He went on to write about how he was firing at an approaching jet that was close enough for us to see the pilot sitting erect in the cockpit. Lynn went on to say that he would long remember the sight of that sinister-looking silver jet with its black swastikas on the side. He also said that although he was very scared, but unbelievably, I was still able to react. Probably good training. After it was all over, he estimated that they had been attacked by 12 German jets over the span of about 15 minutes. He wrote, those 15 minutes seemed like 15 hours because of all the shooting and damage to aircraft. He added, I had been too busy and too scared to pray while we were under attack, but as soon as things quieted down, I recited the best prayers I ever knew. I had never, ever been so scared in all my life. Less than a month after this scary bombing mission, the war in Europe came to an end. Hopefully, these two case studies have given you some real insight into how the fighting in the European theater of the war, as well as the Pacific theater, was carried on by thousands of everyday your typical soldier, as well as by the commanders who probably garnered all the headlines. Undoubtedly, there were many Finger Lakes soldiers like Fran Heard and Lynn that contributed so directly to the successful war effort. Maybe as December 16th approaches this year, you will remember how Fran Heard and so many other soldiers successfully stood their ground and stopped the German counter-advance known as the Battle of the Bulge. The stories of Fran Heard, Lynn, and the other soldiers of World War II are another segment in our Finger Lakes history. I hope you enjoyed this program and that you will look forward to the next segment of our Finger Lakes history.